Ofsted have just adopted the strapline, raising standards and improving lives. If you had 10 points to share out between Ofsted teachers and politicians about how much they've done to raise standards and improve lives, how would you share it out? And does your sharing out reflect the status and authority that each of those three groups seems to have in controlling what's going on in education?
Thank you.
Dennis Jarman, 35 years teaching science.
Thank you, Dennis. And one more. Yes, Mick.
Mick Brooks, NHT. If schools and teachers have never been better, why is it so hard to recruit heads to run them?
Thank you. Michael, do you want to go first?
Yes, I just want to say, with the first question, you mentioned inspectors and teachers, and then I think you mentioned three groups. I may have misheard. Politicians. Well, politicians I would give no points to at all. Between inspectors and teachers, Ed mentioned the need for policy detail. On Ofsted, I think that we do need to have high-quality inspection, and I can well understand why it is that over time we do want to raise the bar. And so it will be the case that inspection in the future will be more exacting. But I do think that there are some problems with the way in which Ofsted operates at the moment. I think that the current 18 areas that Ofsted inspects on are too many. I personally think that Ofsted should just inspect on 4. And my view is, though I'd be interested in people's views, that the 4 on which they should inspect would be the quality of teaching, the quality of leadership, pupils' attainment and achievement, and pupils' behaviour and safety. And I don't believe that any of the other areas should be inspected. I also think that we need to reform Ofsted so we no longer have the concept of limiting judgments. I've been struck by the way in which a huge amount of time has now been devoted to the clerical part of safeguarding in a way which takes the time of professionals away from their core function, which is supporting teaching and learning. So I get rid of these sorts of limiting judgments. And I also think it's the case that far too much time is taken up during the self-evaluation process with filling in a CEF form, which is far more about getting you to conform to what politicians believe is important, rather than you engaging in a proper process of self-reflection and self-evaluation in which you volunteer the information that you believe is important about those areas of strength and those areas of weakness. So, as you can tell, I do believe that we need to reform the way in which Ofsted operates, and critically, we need to ensure that at the, right from the top throughout Ofsted, we have people who have our track record of success in education who can command, as they deserve to, the respect of the teaching profession. But as I mentioned earlier, it's teachers who are the most important, and we may go on to discuss discipline and CPD and some of the other things that we need to change in order to get more people to come into teaching. But I'll leave it at that at this point. On Mick's point about heads, I think one of the reasons why people are reluctant to be heads is that at the moment heads have a great deal of responsibility but not enough power. Stanley Baldwin said that power without responsibility was the prerogative of the harlot throughout the ages. I think responsibility without power is the sad lot of too many head teachers these days. And that's one of the reasons why I think that there should be a greater degree of freedom, control and autonomy for heads. That's one of the reasons why I believe more schools should, if they wish to, adopt academy-style freedoms. And that's why on some areas, like discipline, I believe that heads should have the power to exclude. And that's why I think when it comes to rewarding and motivating staff, heads should have more control over what happens in their schools than they do at the moment. And ultimately, I'd like to see more and more schools acquire the sorts of freedoms that academies have. James Purnell, who's now sadly leaving the House of Commons, said that he'd like academy status, or academy freedoms, to become the norm for secondary schools. I agree with that, and I'd also like to see more and more primary schools acquire those freedoms, because I believe that heads who do have a greater degree of control over the ethos and the policies that govern their schools tend to run schools which are happier, with parents and pupils who achieve more.
Thank you. David.
Yes, on the first question, I agree with some of the things that Michael said about the existing organisation of Ofsted, and I in particular worry about whether some of the safeguarding agenda is diverting from the school improvement agenda. But I think your question was actually more about how the contribution shares out between Ofsted, between politicians and between teachers in relation to school improvement than it was about the organisation of Ofsted. And there I think what is critical is that in all of the schools that we visit that are the best, it is the quality of the leadership and the quality of the teaching that makes the real difference. And the important thing for politicians to recognise is there's no one type of school that magically creates that. It's getting in those good heads and good teachers in, and you can find them in academies, you can find them in specialist schools, you can find them in private schools, grammar schools, you can find them in in inverted commas, bog standard comprehensives, of which I've seen some really exceptional examples. The reason we have a problem in English education is that not every school automatically has good leadership and good teaching. And so over the last 20 years, there has been increasing political control, and there's been increasing inspection and an increasing level of accountability to try to tackle those schools that are not doing a good job, particularly as not every parent and not every child has the opportunity to shop around to go to another school 5 or 10 miles down the road. And it's there, I think, that we have had the right aspiration to try to deliver better accountability, but we've ended up in a place that has relied hugely on giving power to central politicians who don't often know what's going on the ground. I noticed Ed Balls' comment that's quoted in the TES earlier on this week about one academy up in Carlisle where the government missed what was going wrong because he said it was too far away on the train. You know, this is the government that's constantly trying to manage schools from top down. Secondly, we're managing always on the basis of very crude accountability statistics that don't often take into account the catchment that a school is in. And as a consequence, are not fair in making these judgments and can be counterproductive by making it very disadvantageous for teachers and heads to take up posts in some of the most challenging schools because they know that the way in which they will be treated and measured is very different from those in leafier areas. And that's why I believe that this centralisation in political control has come to a point that is so damaging. I think that we've got to let go in terms of political control. We've got to devolve much more down. But that requires a system of intelligent accountability, because the more you have freedom, the more you have diversity, the more you have experimentation, which we desperately need in this country, the more you also need some sort of system of intelligent accountability over the top of it. So, yes, most of this has been driven by teachers, certainly not by politicians, and not on the whole by Ofsted, but we've got to get that system of intelligent accountability right. And on Mick's point about heads, I think the problem is not just one of whether or not they've got freedoms. It's about the level of bureaucracy and imposition on heads, because some heads do want more freedom. And whenever I hear heads say that, I am absolutely delighted. I want schools to be as innovative as possible. But there are some heads, including those in very small schools, who don't just want more freedom because they associate that with being left alone, unsupported. We have to acknowledge that sometimes there are schools that do want that support. And so giving freedom where people are able to take it up, giving support for those heads in those particular positions, and making sure in general that the level of bureaucracy on schools is reduced is incredibly important. My very final point relating to smaller schools is this, that I often go to small schools where there are people who are paid a very similar level to the head, who are just below the head's level, who frankly see the massive amount of additional responsibility that these days head teachers have, and the very small amount of additional money they get paid for it, and wonder whether it's really worth all those additional pressures. And that says to me both reduce the amount of bureaucracy on the heads and also make sure that there is a proper reward for the step up between deputy head and senior leadership roles and head teacher, which is a very big responsibility these days.